Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for what is a really timely and important conversation. I'm joined tonight by Assistant Professor from our Department of Chemistry, Ryan Davis. My name is Tess Coody-Anders. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for what is a really timely and I've been spending the last 8 or 9 months working almost entirely on COVID and COVID preparation at Trinity. So I am particularly pleased to have Professor Davis with us tonight to talk about his area of research, which is very germane and a great reminder for all of us as we prepare to go into the holidays and spend time with family and friends in a safe way. He's got some great information and research to share with us that will help provide a roadmap for our safety. So, Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about your background and your research and just tell us why you are an expert that we should listen to tonight about how to protect ourselves from the transmission of the COVID-19 virus?
Absolutely. So I am an aerosol scientist, and what that looks like specifically and why it's related to disease transmission is, so what we do in my lab is we develop a lot of different aerosol methods. I'm an expert, our research group is an expert at looking how aerosols and droplets can change over time. There's an example here. We have different levitation setups that we can actually look at chemical and physical changes of droplets. We look at the physics of mass, how droplets interact with different surfaces. And also, we look at how aerosols and droplets move through the air. You see an example in the lower right here that's just looking at droplets and how they move from point A to point B. And I want to be real clear, I'm not a virologist. I am, again, an aerosol scientist. And the reason aerosol science and droplets are relevant to disease transmission is that viruses, bacteria, they're unable to move on their own. They are always hitching a ride on either droplets or aerosols. And just recently, here's a quote from guidance from the Public Health Agency of Canada. I put this quote up just because Canadian guidance came out very recently. They updated their guidance to point out that SARS-CoV-2, it can spread through respiratory droplets and aerosols created when an infected person coughs, sneezes, sings, shouts, or talks. I'd add that there's also the possibility that just even breathing can generate aerosols that can spread viruses. But before I go into exactly talking about disease transmission, in my research, I want to clarify what aerosols are. I'm sure most people are familiar with the term droplets, but aerosols is a less common term. Most people are familiar with aerosol spray cans, hairspray, and that is a form of aerosol. So an aerosol are tiny particles suspended in the gas. When we're talking about disease transmission and environmental applications, that gas will just be the air we breathe. Some examples to kind of calibrate you to what aerosols are, and so you can start kind of thinking intuitively about how aerosols transmit. I have some examples here. So if you've ever seen a cloud, you're familiar with atmospheric aerosols. Cloud droplets, they're very small, about 10 to 40 micrometers, and a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So they're very small. Dust aerosol, and that's about the size of a bacteria. And then what I'm going to refer to a lot tonight is talking about smoke aerosol, because everyone has experience with how smoke transmits through the air, right? So smoke is a classic example of an aerosol particle. And then for relevance to disease transmission, when we're breathing, when we're talking, speaking, we're also generating respiratory aerosol particles. And those aerosol particles, they can carry contagious material. Here on the bottom right is a picture from a recent article in Proceedings of National Academy of Science, which shows distinguishing between aerosols and droplets. And before I get really deep into talking about the infectious disease transmission, I want to take a moment to just walk through what we know about disease transmission and why it's important distinguishing between aerosols and droplet transmission. Okay, so I'm going to go to my whiteboard and I'm going to use my excellent illustration skills here. We're going to say this person is infected with a virus. It doesn't have to be SARS-CoV-2. It could be influenza. It could be a bacterial strain. If this person is infected and they cough, and if anyone's ever seen someone cough or sneeze in the light and the light catches just right, you can see droplets and stuff is flying out of their mouth. And part of what comes out of their mouth is big, what we refer to as droplets. Droplets are very large, 100 micrometers or more, which is still small, but large, large enough to fall to the ground fairly rapidly. And typically, what we refer to as droplets, they fall to the ground in what is traditionally considered about 6 feet. Okay? When someone coughs, those droplets, they can splash onto a surface. It can be a table, it could be a doorknob, they can cough into their hand, it can get on some surface. Where some uninfected individual comes in later, touches that surface, they can then get virus or bacteria in their hand and then transfer that to their nose, eyes, mouth, and that can trigger infection. We refer to this as surface contact. You also see it, well, it's referred to as fomite transmission. I'll refer to it as surface transmission. Now, if we have a second person come in, that'd be one mode of transmission, surface transmission. The CDC and public health officials, they think the surface transmission is a minor transmission route for COVID-19. About maybe 10% of new cases are thought to be through this surface contact. So if we have a second person come in, and stand within this 6-foot radius, when that person coughs or sneezes, and droplets are going to come out of their mouth, and they can go and land directly in someone's eyes, nose, or mouth. And that can also trigger an infection, which is not good. So this is the basis for the general recommendation of physical distancing. The further you are from someone, the less likely these droplets, when someone coughs, sneezes, will directly impact into your mouth, nose, or eyes. This we refer to as droplet transmission. You think of it as just a ballistic transmission. Droplets coming out of someone's mouth, landing in your eyes, directly in your mouth.
That's what you might see, Ryan, if you cough or sneeze into your hand and you see those droplets, that wetness on your hand, in the absence of covering your mouth or your nose when you cough or sneeze, or if you're speaking loudly and maybe you're, you might spit a little, that's what you might see, but it's making its way out of your mouth and onto the ground or to surfaces around you within that 6 feet. Exactly. So you're imagining what you would cough or sneeze into your hand. That's what's going on to the surfaces or the floors around you. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay.
Yep. And it can happen while talking. Definitely when you cough and sneeze, you generate more of these droplets.
But you could do it when you're talking too, right? Singing, all of that. Exercising, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So we recommend that people stay 6 feet away. We recommend that people put masks on. That's going to be the base of the mask. The mask can keep these droplets from coming out of someone's mouth in the first place. And also, if you're uninfected wearing a mask, then it can prevent someone's droplets from getting inside your mouth. The idea is that if you move outside of the 6-foot radius, then they're going to splash on the floor, they're going to splash on the surface. As long as you're 6 feet away and you're washing your hands, then maybe the disease won't get transmitted. But as someone just even breathes, when they talk, sing, cough, sneeze, these simultaneously to generate these droplets, there are thousands, well, what are called aerosols. And aerosols, unlike droplets, they don't fall to the ground. They can linger in the air longer. Not only can they linger in the air longer, but they can also transmit longer distances. And now it becomes possible that even at greater than 6 feet of separation, that you can still be inhaling infectious aerosol particles. And until recently, public health officials were a bit resistant to acknowledge that this airborne transmission route happens, but we're seeing a change where more and more global organizations are recognizing, yes, this aerosol route here, it actually happens and it can be a driver of COVID-19. Not to say droplet transmission and surface transmission are not also happening, but it's important to recognize that we have these 3 different modes of transmission happening, and you understand how to mitigate the risk of all 3.
And Ryan, the aerosol transmission is happening even when you're not coughing and sneezing, just to reinforce what you were saying.
Correct.
That it could be as you're having a conversation, if you're singing, if you're laughing, talking loudly. Anytime you have your mouth open or you're breathing out of your nose, you could be aerosolizing the virus, correct? It's not just when you cough or sneeze.
And in fact, I'll bring it up right now. When you're wearing a mask, you'll sometimes see someone take their mask off to talk. So I think it's kind of human nature to want to interact face to face. But as you're talking, you're generating more aerosol. You're also generating more droplets. So the mask is even more important to have on as you're speaking. We also know that the louder you speak, the more aerosol you generate, the more droplets you generate. So the more you're exposing to other people if you are an infected individual.
And if the person who is being spoken to, keeping your mask on offers, we're going to talk about that, some level of protection against the person who's removed their mask, who's aerosolizing or causing droplets of the virus, correct?
Exactly. And which you bring up a great point. It's not just an infected individual. When we don't really know who's infected, oftentimes with asymptomatic spread. And so this is the basis for universal masking, is that it works more effectively if everyone's wearing a mask than if someone's asymptomatic and they're spreading it, they can reduce exposure to everyone else around them. So the idea is not just to wear a mask to reduce your risk, but also to reduce the risk of other people in case you are infected.
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan.
So I'm going to switch back to slides here. So I wanted to walk everyone through this general idea of talking about 3 different modes of transmission. Here's a more formal infographic showing the same effect, but with a little bit more detail. Regardless of whether it is droplet transmission or aerosol transmission, I want to emphasize that the closer you are in proximity to someone, the more your exposure. So regardless of whether we're talking about droplets or aerosols, you want to maximize your separation. And what I really like about this image here is that kind of illustrates that with this high density of aerosols coming right out of someone's mouth. And this makes sense if you can picture a smoker when they first exhale a puff of smoke. There's just a large concentration of smoke right there, and then it dissipates. The difference between droplets and aerosols really is that with aerosols, they can transmit over longer distances. And understanding and distinguishing between droplets and aerosols is really important, because what we really need for combating the pandemic or just combating the spread of disease is what we call a layered risk mitigation strategy. So we have all these 3 different modes of transmission, and limiting risk looks different depending on what we're talking about here. There's some that are just universal. Doesn't matter if we're talking about which mode of transmission we're talking about. They're just common sense things that we should be doing. So avoiding crowds just automatically limits your probability of exposure. Universal masking, whether we're talking about surfaces, aerosols, or droplets, universal masking prevents infected people from putting their junk on the table, basically, or their viral material in the air. I also emphasize masking helps, but does not completely eliminate risk, which is why we have these other mitigation strategies. I'm going to talk more in detail about a lot of these specific points, but if you want to limit surface and aerosols, just get outdoors. Disease transmission is much lower outdoors. Whether we're talking about aerosols or droplets, physical distance is key. To mitigate the risk associated with droplets, you can wear safety glasses to prevent droplets from getting in your eyes. And you'll see a lot of these, again, match up with combating the spread from two different modes of transmission. But I want to highlight tonight, in particular, is what has been discussed probably the least in the media and in terms of public health guidance. And that would be looking specifically at some of the mitigation strategies associated with combating the spread of aerosols, such as ventilation, filtration, controlling humidity, and just limiting time indoors in poorly ventilated spaces. And again, something to be aware of is that just breathing, talking, having a conversation, these are going to be aerosol generating activities. This is down here is a quote from Professor Lindsay Marr, who is one of the world's leading aerosol experts, pointing out that no one risk mitigation strategy is going to be a cure-all. We need to have a combination of everything.
Ryan, one of the corollaries to this that we talk about at Trinity that I wondered if you would weigh in on or agree with is that as you're thinking about your risk, the level of risk that you have, that we tell students, faculty, and staff that you need to think of it as being there are 4 dimensions to risk. It's the environment you're in. Are you indoors or are you outdoors? Are you in a small environment, an enclosed environment with poor ventilation, or are you outdoors? What activity are you engaged in? Are you exercising? Are you talking? Are you lecturing? Are you being lectured to? Are you playing a wind instrument? Are you laughing loudly? Third, what distance are you from other people? Are you at least 6 feet apart from everyone, and can you maintain that? And then lastly, how much time, how long are you going to be in that environment with that activity, with that distance from people? Does that seem like an appropriate corollary to the idea of creating a layered defense? And
yes,
how important that layered defense is depending on how risk dense your activity is?
Yes, I could not have said it better than myself, because your level of risk, so if you're outdoors, your risk of transmission goes down for a whole number of reasons. So now the need for, say, an N95 respirator or N95 mask goes down because your risk has already gone down from being outdoors. So definitely thinking about where you're at, what you're doing, how long you're going to be doing it for is essential for practical risk mitigation.
Thank you.
And thank you for that very well put statement. So I want to highlight a case study from early on in the pandemic that kind of illustrates the fact that we need this layered risk mitigation. Early on, public health guidance was really emphasizing 6 feet of separation, wash your hands. I'm sure everyone remembers that there was a period where masks were not recommended, and they're really pushing social distance, and hand washing, don't touch your face. So this was a case study in China where there was one infected patient on a bus. It was a 1-hour bus trip to a religious service, and then an hour bus trip back. During that time, there was a large number of infections. That one patient spread COVID-19 to roughly half the people on the bus. You'll notice that there was significant spread well beyond 6 feet of separation. And this is an example of a scenario where it's unlikely that every 50% of the people on the bus touch the same exact surface. It's unlikely that the infected individual coughed on every single one of these people directly. And it is best explained through aerosol transmission. And this is a case where I think it really highlights the importance of interdisciplinarity, is that one of the things highlighted in this case study is you'll notice these red things here, these red circles with squiggly line, that's meant to indicate an air vent. And on this bus, they were recirculating the air. And I mentioned that aerosols can linger in the air. So when you combine kind of the civil engineering aspects of how the ventilation on the bus worked with the physics of aerosols lingering in the air, this completely can explain how so many people were infected despite 6 feet of separation, despite not touching contaminated surfaces. And there's been just many. Go ahead.
Just to clarify. So what we're looking at is the dark red was patient 0, and no one else at the time that he or she entered the bus was infected. But the result of them spending some amount of time with patient 0 on this bus resulted in all of these asymptomatic, mild cases, moderate cases. That was the result of their exposure to our patient 0 in this example, right? Those are not people that were already infected, just to clarify.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. So there was one person that got on the bus infected, no one else infected at that time. After this trip, roughly half of the people that had been on the bus became infected and the only connection there they had was with that one infected individual on the bus. And there have been lots of examples like this where you get these super spreading events. Another example, early in the pandemic in Washington, there was a choir practice where one infected individual spread COVID-19 to 51 out of 63 other people, even though some people hadn't even come within 50 feet of the infected person. And these are examples of super spreading transmission events that can only be explained by the presence of aerosols. And so this is why the distinguishing between aerosols and droplets, understanding how to protect and mitigate both is very important for combating the spread.
And so as you were, just to put that in the context of the season we're about to come into, people are going to be invited to go to a lot of, it's going to happen. People are going to have get-togethers. Yep. And so if you were invited to a party roughly the size of the riders on that bus, if one person in that party were to be infected and unknown to the rest of everyone in attendance and be in an unventilated or a poorly ventilated area, even if it were a party where you could stay somewhat apart, it's possible that that event could result in, without all the defense strategies you discussed before, that could be an event where you could pick up the virus and spread it to other people.
Exactly. Right, that's kind of what is really motivating doing this webinar at this point, is we're in San Antonio, we still get really nice weather, but we're entering a period of time where people are more likely to start coming indoors. And so understanding the risk associated with being inside, especially with lots of other people, being able to understand that risk and how to mitigate it is going to be really important as we go through the holiday season. Okay. So I want to discuss some really basic physics of droplets and aerosols. There's really just 2 principles that I want to highlight that will help us understand all the other mitigation strategies I'm going to be talking about. I think a lot of mitigation strategies don't make sense unless you understand the context about what is happening here. So early on the pandemic, the idea of aerosol transmission is from the WHO and CDC. It was downplayed. It wasn't really recognized as likely to be a significant source of spread. And part of the reason behind that is that we have these droplets. They're very large and they contain the highest amount of the viral load or bacterial load. But there are very few of them and they settle out quickly. But they're large size, because you have to have more than one virus to actually trigger an infection. So it seemed natural to assume that droplets were the main drivers because they just carry more virus. But like I mentioned, there just aren't many droplets and they settle out quickly. By contrast, we have these aerosols that are very small, about 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So they don't carry much viral material individually, but there are very many of them. So for every one droplet that comes out of our mouth, on average, we have 1,000 aerosol particles. So even if one droplet might be carrying 1,000 viruses, there's one virus per aerosol particle. So the viral load ends up being perhaps comparable.
Was your analogy, Ryan, about with someone who smokes? Would you say that you know how you've entered a room after someone has been smoking in that room, and you can still either see or smell the smoke for a pretty good period of time? Is that kind of metaphorically how you might think about if you could see or smell the virus? It's a lot like that. I mean, is that a way to kind of gauge it?
Yes, and I'm glad you bring up that point because aerosols, they're small, so they can linger in the air. The force of gravity just doesn't work on them very much. They can accumulate in rooms. They can linger in the air, similar to cigarette smoke. So if you entered a room after someone had been smoking, that smoke's still going to be in there. The same with these aerosols, which brings me up to one of the points with room occupancy that I wanted to make, at least for mitigating risk, is the importance of, even if you're in a room alone, if it's a shared space like a study room, someplace in a library where someone's likely to come in immediately after you, it's still a good idea to have your mask on to reduce the amount of aerosols lingering in the air when the next person comes in.
And I just want to reinforce, Ryan, what you said there is that's actually part of our Protect TU Health Pledge policy. And I know it's confusing, but if you are in a study room in the library, or the easy way to say it is, if you are any place in the community where another student, faculty, or staff member might come in immediately after you or within, a few minutes of you, that you should wear a mask in that space or place. If that makes sense. So that's kind of how we're approaching it from a pledge standpoint.
Yep. And that's one of those rules that I know Trinity has in place that might not make sense based on what WHO had been saying about disease transmission. But I'm glad that Trinity has that rule in place because as it's becoming more apparent that aerosols contribute to the spread, it becomes really much more important.
I understand why it's confusing because you think I'm alone, I'm by myself, so why do I need to wear a mask? And you're explaining why. Because you'll be breathing, and if you're breathing, you're aerosolizing the virus and you're leaving it to linger there like an unwanted study partner when you leave and the next person comes in. And that's why we wear a mask even when we're alone in those spaces.
Exactly. And I don't think this happens. It's unlikely to be the case at Trinity. The buildings are well designed, but some buildings you might actually have rooms connected through the ventilation, and you can spread through aerosols, breathing it out. Ventilation can transfer from one room to another, and you don't even have to be in the same room necessarily.
Yeah, that's a scary point. When we were first assessing the campus infrastructure, that's something that facilities took a close look at. And while some of our facilities are older, we are fortunate that our HVAC system is newer and that we didn't have a lot of that. We didn't have that risk, but that is something to think about as we go into other buildings and other environments and go home for the holidays, for sure.
Yeah. And I think it is very rare for that to happen, but it can. and something to be aware of. So I don't want to mean to scare anybody, but just knowledge is power. And the other thing I want to emphasize here, talking about sizes, is historically in infectious disease transmission, it was thought that if a droplet or particle was 5 micrometers or larger, it would fall out of the air. And so it was assumed that there was not much viral material floating around in the air. But the reality is, based on the physics of how droplets, I'm trying to play this video here. There we go. You see it. So this is an example of an experiment we did in our lab, looking at whether larger droplets actually float in the air. So you're seeing here, there's a flashlight. I have a droplet dispenser right here. This droplet dispenser is making droplets that are about 50 micrometers, which would be considered a large droplet. And historically, it would be assumed that if someone coughed out a 50 micrometer droplet, that it would fall to the ground. But as an aerosol scientist, I just knew that's not how it works. Any room, any building occupied anywhere is going to have enough convection to keep those droplets aloft in the air. As we can see these here, is that they're floating around. So there's just a lot more material, respiratory particles that can stay in the air for longer than has been considered historically. So that's the first kind of point I want to talk about, is the size. Large droplets, they have a tendency to follow. Smaller aerosols, they can linger in the air. The other concept I want to talk about is that at our mouth, when we cough, when we talk, those aerosols, those droplets that come out, they're going to be the largest that they possibly can be. Because as soon as they're into the air, they start evaporating some of their water. As the water evaporates off, these droplets, the aerosols, they shrink out down to be smaller. So this will become important when we're talking about masking, the idea of universal masking. It also is what makes controlling relative humidity indoors potentially important. Is the idea that when we cough, those droplets get smaller. As they get smaller, they can stay in the air longer.
It's almost like it's designed insidiously to transmit and infect. I mean, it's almost all too perfect.
Yeah, nature's been working on that for a while.
Yeah, nature is really efficient like that.
Mm-hmm. And which brings me to the next, talking about mitigation strategies more carefully. Again, addressing the idea, I know there's been some disagreement about whether universal masking is effective, disagreement whether masks are effective at all. And just from a aerosol perspective, we know that if you have your mouth covered, you can more effectively keep your respiratory particles to yourself. And they're really our first line of defense against getting our infectious material out in the world. And so this here on the left is a graphic from a recent perspective by Kim Prather and Associates that was published in Science. It's kind of illustrating that if someone is infected but asymptomatic with no mask, they're putting all that infectious material out into the world. Maximum exposure, if someone healthy is not wearing a mask, they're going to be inhaling that into their lungs, getting it in the eyes, and you have your maximum risk for triggering an infection. When we get the minimum exposure is when we have universal masking. When an infected person is wearing a mask, that keeps the droplets from coming out of their mouths really effectively. And it can cut down the number of aerosols that are emitted. I don't want to give the impression that masks are 100% effective at blocking aerosols. Some aerosols do make it through. And I know right now a lot of people are making their own masks. I think it's important to point out that some materials work better than others for blocking aerosol. Over here on the right is showing the filtration efficiency for several different materials may basically, my household materials here. Vacuum bag is the top in the green. It shows that it is very effective at filtering out particles regardless of size. And then typical household materials, they're very much less efficient at filtering out the particles that are about 200 nanometers to 300 nanometers in diameter. If you recall, I had mentioned that at our mouth, respiratory aerosols are about 1 micrometer. And even common household materials that are shown here, like a jersey material, are quite effective at cutting down about 50% of the aerosol that come out of our mouth. And as we'll talk about, we don't need 100% protection in order to lower the risk. Now, if everyone could wear N95 all the time, the disease transmission would be incredibly low. I know the reality is we're going to end up wearing household masks, and that does help, even if it doesn't completely eliminate the risk. And then the other point I wanted to make about this slide here is that our mouths, our respiratory droplets are about 1 micrometer, and we have reasonable efficiency for filtering those out. As they evaporate down about half in size to 400 or 500 nanometers, where mask material is much less efficient. So this is where having universal masking and having even asymptomatic people that might not feel sick or aren't necessarily concerned about getting the virus is still important and much more effective if asymptomatic people or just everyone is wearing it, because then we are more efficiently preventing infectious material from getting out in the air in the first place.
So if we're all wearing masks as we're talking, we're helping to limit it coming and going.
Exactly. And it is much more effective at keeping it from going than getting in, just because we get this evaporation effect. And I'll point out, even really common household materials, you get to larger droplets, like they're flying out of your mouth, and they impact into the droplet or into the mask material. And so most mask material, very effective at blocking these larger droplets. So it's really true that any face covering is better than no covering. You're going to see a wide variation in how well aerosols are blocked by different mask materials, but there are not very many materials that are not effective at blocking droplets. I wanted to highlight a couple important things about homemade masks. As we know that the more layers you have, the better. It's recommended that you have 3 layers of fabric. And that's illustrated over here on the left. This was a microscope. We put a neck gaiter, a sport neck gaiter, is polystyrene material under a microscope. And you can see anywhere where there's light coming through, these are large gaps. And this is just a single layer of a Buff brand neck gaiter. When we stretch it, these gaps become quite huge. So those gaps, they become large enough where some droplets can sneak through, but a lot of aerosol are also going to sneak through, because the small aerosol, they don't just have a lot of momentum and smack into these fibers. They will follow the airstream through these gaps. And when we double layer it, just put 2 layers of that same neck gaiter together, you can see just visually how much more blockage there's going to be. So it's important when you're making your own mask, 3 layers is recommended.
You know, Ryan, when the pandemic first started, I had a friend make some masks that included a little sleeve between the 2 layers, and we would cut small coffee filters and put in between the 2 pieces of fabric. Is that a decent 3rd layer that's in between even a coffee filter, or would it be better, do you think, to have just 2 or 3 layers of fabric? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, no, I think it is a great 3rd layer. Off the top of my head, I don't know if I've seen measurements specifically looking at that, but I know coffee filters, they're not very porous. I think it's a great 3rd layer. I myself do that as well. Early in the pandemic, we put in different materials like even paper towels.
Just thinking those are household materials that people have on hand, and you may not always have a vacuum bag you could cut, but you might have things, anything that you're adding a third layer is that's less porous is probably better than nothing, right?
Exactly. As we're coming back, anything is better than nothing. 3 layers, even if that third layer is just this really fine, silky material, any third layer, no matter what it is better than just 2 layers.
Hey, Ryan, right here, I should say, I don't think we did at the beginning, that if folks have questions, they can ask their question, and we'll be sure to get it in the chat. So if you have questions like I had, please feel free to ask them and we'll work them into the conversation.
Yeah, and I really welcome questions because this topic is just so broad that it's not possible to cover every possible angle. And so questions are very much welcome. I also want to emphasize fit. So for droplets are coming out of your mouth at a fast momentum. The fit might not be as important, but aerosol, they're just kind of follow along in the airstream. So if you don't have a good fit on your mask, you're going to have significant amount of leakage around your sides. So trying to get no gaps between your mask and your skin is important for eliminating the amount of transmission.
And it's also important, right, Ryan, that your mask cover your nose, the top of your nose. Like sometimes you see folks, they're doing a good job covering their mouth rather, but not always covering their nose. It really has to be both, right?
The nose is important because we do have aerosol coming out of our nose. When you sneeze, especially, there's lots of stuff coming out. And also, your nose is a pathway where you can get infected. So covering the nose is important. And I have found with my own homemade masks that also, this is a hard place to get a good fit. And I've been taking just 20 gauge electrical wire and slipping it in there and using that to get a better fit.
So you can kind of conform it around the bridge of your nose.
Yeah.
And that helps. Yeah.
Next to the N95s, surgical masks, they have kind of wire material to form that. Household material, I found electrical wire works really well. And I emphasize again that masks are not a cure-all. They mitigate risk, but they do not eliminate it. So just because people are wearing masks, infections still happen. We've seen it. I know people who were in unventilated environments for like 2 hours with a bunch of people wearing a mask, still got infected. You still have to exercise caution in other regards when you're wearing.
This is why we say you have to maintain distance. You have to think about the activity that you're involved in. And if it's going to be higher risk activity, you need to limit the amount of time, sure to maintain space, and be sure to wear a mask and wash your hands.
I think that's my next point. You mentioned time. Yes, my next recommendation is pay attention to the time, because when you're inside a confined space with someone, the effect of physical distance becomes less important. I see this frequently. Someone will be sitting 8 feet apart from each other, say at a restaurant, and I think people kind of get into the sense where, well, we're beyond 6 feet, we no longer need masks. We can sit here indefinitely, especially now that people are acknowledging aerosol transmission. That's just not how it works, really. Transmission as far as 50 feet has been reported. And so when you're in an indoor environment, as people are breathing, so you think about smoke, a smoker, it's going to fill up the room. Eventually, you're just going to have more and more accumulation, especially if there's poor ventilation. And as you increase the amount of time that you're spent in there, you get more accumulation of respiratory aerosols, and that increases your exposure, the amount of viral load you have. So you don't need just one virus to trigger an infection. It takes some number of viruses. So the longer you're in a room with someone, maskless, the more likely you're going to have an infection triggered. My recommendation, just based on what I've kind of seen, is that even with the mask, being in a closed indoor space with someone for over an hour is you're really significantly increasing your risk. So limit the amount of time. And also, if you're 8 feet apart, 10 feet apart, if you're in a room together, you still want to have your mask, because like I'd mentioned with the household materials, with the mask efficiency of even 50%, that can cut down on the amount of aerosols that are accumulated by 50%, and then therefore reduce your risk by 50%. So maybe whereas without a mask, you would have triggered an infection in an hour, with a mask, you might have it triggered and you might up that to about 2 hours. You still, I would recommend no more than an hour in a closed environment with someone.
And that speaks, I think, Ryan, to sort of what the CDC offers as the definition of close contact, which is what we use in our contact tracing, is this idea that if you're with someone not observing the 6 foot or greater rule and unmasked from 15 minutes, and they did say 15 minutes continuously, and now it's 15 minutes total, right, over a course of a day, then that's considered a close contact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if you're unmasked within 6 feet, just the concentration is just so much higher. So that number goes down.
Yeah, and that's where people end up needing to quarantine after someone was infected. So it's definitely a good call out. And I know we'll get to this, but I think this leads to some really good discussions or recommendations about how we can do things safely over the holidays, spend time together, but to do it as safely as possible. I think you're pointing to some good solutions we can talk about.
Yep. And so trying to limit the amount of time with people, especially outside of your, because you can't really limit the amount of time you spend with your people in your household. But people outside of the household, increasing the distance is important, but as you increase the time you spend with that person, your risk is still going to go up. It's not like 6 feet's not magical. Wearing a mask is not going to be 100% protective. So you just kind of have a lot of different ways of mitigating your risk. Which brings me to the next point. I think talking about going home, visiting friends, and having typical holiday activities. It's important to think about ventilation. So now that we're acknowledging aerosol transmission, ventilation becomes really important. You'll notice that public health guidance early in the pandemic did not mention ventilation too often. We hear that more and more. That's because of the idea of that as we are breathing, talking, speaking, all that, we're just accumulating respiratory aerosols, but we can flush those out with proper ventilation. When you're cooking your Thanksgiving dinner and you start burning the turkey, how do you flush out the smoke? You open the windows. The same thing if you are having friends over, family over, in your home, air is almost, I don't know a single home that the air is not recirculated. And so ventilation really comes in from bringing outdoor air in through open windows or open doors. And even opening your windows in your home by 2 inches can really increase the ventilation and cause much more turnover in the air that you're breathing. For buildings, it's being recommended that you ventilate with outdoor air. And I know Trinity does this, which is excellent. A lot of smaller businesses, some restaurants do not ventilate with outdoor air. And you can always spot when someone's using recirculated air. You can see the traditional vent where the air return is. Homes have them. You can spot them in restaurants. And so you can spot restaurants where ventilation is not going to prevent transmission. And the recommendation in terms of air changes, which for, again, residential homes, this is hard to control, but 6 air changes per hour, meaning the volume of air coming into the room or the building is turned over 6 times. That's something that a facilities manager can control within businesses or within university. I don't know what Trinity's air change rate is, but the WHO recently came out and acknowledged, yes, we should be increasing ventilation.
Ryan, some people have talked about, adding HEPA filters to their rooms or their offices, or how valuable are the kind of retail available HEPA filters in to helping with the the ventilation. And oh, I got ahead of
Never
you.
mind.
Sorry.
The next up, because a lot of times increasing ventilation is just not financially possible. Homes do not have are rarely ventilated with outdoor air, and in the absence of really good ventilation, these portable HEPA filters are a really good way of helping kind of purify the air. Now, my wife, she's a teacher. She has one in her classroom. I really recommend them for classrooms that do not have proper ventilation or windows. Even some schools don't have windows. And there's a really good a site that is controlled. It's a Harvard CU Boulder site that I have towards the end of the slides, where you could, if you're a classroom teacher or you are interested in getting a air purifier for your own house, you can recommend what air purifier to get. Yes, filtration. In the absence of ventilation, filtration is excellent idea. For buildings, it's being recommended that MERV 13 filters are being used if the HVAC system can handle it. And talking about this civil engineering and the indoor environment, that's really getting outside of my expertise. So I can kind of reiterate what is being recommended without going into specifics. There's a lot more discussion about HVACs on ASHRAE's website. I do know filtration is important. And for more details, ASHRAE has an excellent website. Now, it brings me to one of my final points about risk mitigation that I've been really harping on since the first days of the pandemic, is that there's no better way to mitigate your risk than just to be outside. And risk disease transmission, whether we're talking about flu, COVID, doesn't matter what, it's just much lower outdoors. And we don't fully understand why that is, but one reason is that outdoors, aerosols do not accumulate. It is basically infinite ventilation. As soon as someone breathes aerosols out, it's swept away. Because aerosols are so small, they just are gone. You can think about it in terms of everyone has enjoyed sitting around a campfire, and it's outdoors. It's a really pleasurable experience. You can have a raging fire, and the smoke does not become overwhelming. You might be able to smell it, but it's not driving you away. Take that same fire, put it into even a large classroom, and just within a few minutes, like even with excellent ventilation, it's just going to be overwhelmed with smoke. And there's no replacement for the outdoor environment in terms of mitigating your risk. Some other factors, obviously outdoors, are that the sun just sanitizes surfaces. It can deactivate viruses and bacteria. So there's just so many benefits to being outdoors. I think that's the...
Yeah, Ryan, so we have a question from Krista. She's asking, and you might be quantifying it here, I think this may be the answer, that, by what measure are you reducing risk by being outdoors? What metric would you say is so is it 20 times lower? Is that what you're suggesting here?
So I say at least 20 times lower, okay, if not more. So if you have, for example, I would estimate that one of these super spreading events, like the choir super spreading event where 51 of 63 people were infected, if that had been outdoors, the chance or probability of even a single infection within that 2.5 hour time frame would be less than 1%.
Gotcha.
It's a huge difference. An early review about indoors or an early review about COVID transmission from back in May as it was spreading through China found that of about 1,000 infections, only 2 happened outdoors. And it was both times like really close face-to-face contact. As long as you're aware of the idea that droplets, if you're outdoors, droplets are going to be your main place of source of infection.
Distance, being 6 feet apart outdoors is where, that's why we say, for example, at Trinity, that even if you're outdoors, if you can't maintain 6 feet of distance, you should still wear your mask. And that would be because mostly the droplet transmission that you could face, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So is this kind of consistent with, how we've noticed this flip-flop over the course of the year, where in the summer, the southern and western warmer states saw big spikes in the transmission of the disease. It was hot and people were spending more time, we think, more time indoors. And perhaps that is, had been a source of the transmission. And now we're seeing in the northern states, as things are colder and people are having to retreat indoors, we're seeing more transmission. So that's something for all of us to think about as we go into the winter months and go home, depending on where we go home to. So if, for example, over the break, if we are getting together with family, if we could do that, if we live in a climate like San Antonio, doing that sort of an outdoor gathering 6 feet apart would be, if you got to do it outdoors if you can.
Yeah. I try and do everything outdoors, and I definitely, when I'm outdoors, understanding kind of how that disease transmission happens, especially when I'm 6 feet away from people. I know that the transmission rate is very low, and that just being outdoors is much better.
Great, thank you.
And the temperature, we saw in Arizona and Texas as we were getting, into the hundreds, huge spikes in cases. And that is exactly what my theory was, that people were coming indoors. Now we're seeing that as it's getting cold in the north, the same spikes. And we had a question about, okay, well, getting outdoors, how much relatively does that lower transmission? It's hard to put numbers to that, but we can also kind of like put relative numbers to some of these other risk mitigation strategies that I had forgotten to kind of mention as we go along the way. So like putting on a mask with 50% efficiency, you can cut down your risk by about 50%. So for the choir super spreading event where there was an 86% transmission rate, if at that point people were wearing masks with a 50% efficiency, then we could have reduced that potentially the number of transmissions down to 40 to 50%. That event was 2.5 hours. If that had been cut down to an hour and 15 minutes, to cut the time down in half, then the risk could have been cut down potentially in half. Same with increasing ventilation. And you can cut down spread potentially by a third by increasing ventilation, or if not more, depending on if you're going from unventilated to any level of ventilation, you're going to significantly reduce your risk. And these numbers I'm talking about are from a COVID spread estimator for estimating aerosol transmission that was developed by a professor at University of Colorado Boulder, which I have the website for people that are interested. And it's a very helpful tool for understanding relative risk. And then my last point that I guess not my last point. I actually just noticed I have one more slide after this. Almost last point about risk mitigation is something that hasn't been discussed very much, is that humidity seems to really influence the survival of viruses, both on surfaces and in aerosol particles. Like I mentioned, the large droplets, they fly and they land on surfaces much, so it's not going to influence droplet transmission too much, but it does influence surface and aerosol transmission. And it seems that the sweet spot for optimizing, basically deactivating virus, is about 50 to 55% relative humidity. Below that, it's possible that all the material in our saliva and respiratory emissions kind of crystallize to protect the virus. At high relative humidity is really dilute because there's so much water, and so deactivation occurs slower. And there's a sweet spot is about 50 to 55%. In our house, I have a very small house with lots of people. I have kids, my wife, dogs, and so our humidity tends to be higher. We've gotten a dehumidifier to try and optimize the relative humidity about 50%. If you have a larger house during the summer, or excuse me, during the winter, if you're running the heater a lot, you might be getting very low humidity, and you might consider actually humidifying your house. I think within the large businesses like Trinity, I'm not quite sure how we control humidity, but I know it is kept about 50 to 55% in the optimal area.
We have an actual dashboard with controls that they set measures on and metrics, and it like sets triggers when it drops below or goes above a certain set of humidity. So the facilities guys are
many benefits. Like if it's too high, you're gonna get mold. If it's too low, that can influence like wood and other things, and also your skin.
I really don't know this. I'm embarrassed. Probably I should know. In your home, how do you know what the relative humidity is in your home at any time? Is there a device? Is it something you can measure from your HVAC system? How does one get a sense of that?
No, that's a great question. So you can buy really cheap relative humidity sensors. There's a few dollars for Amazon, or maybe not a few dollars, $10. My personal HVAC system, the climate control, has a relative humidity sensor built into it. Relative humidity sensors are quite inexpensive.
Got it. Sounds like a good investment this time of year.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, if you're living in San Antonio and you don't have a relative humidity sensor already to kind of monitor, so when you go a bunch above 60 to 70, mold becomes really problematic.
Great, thank you.
And then my final point I want to make in terms of risk mitigation and selecting activities, it's been hit on several times already, and I want to show the actual data here. Over here on the left, it shows that actually how loud you talk does matter in terms of how many aerosols you're actually generating. So talking loudly generates significantly more particles per second than quiet talking. And then just breathing normally from your mouth and nose, so you actually are generating aerosol from your nose, but very, very small amounts. And as you go into shouting and singing, you start generating even more aerosol. And if you're doing choir practice, it's a good idea then to say, okay, since we are singing, even shift the amount of time spent together to shorter time scales. And some people generate more aerosol during normal activities than others. And it's thought that these super emitters are potentially the drivers of these super spreading events. We're finding that a very small number of infected people actually cause a huge number of cases. And the idea that some people just are super emitters might explain this. So you think about what you're doing, where you're doing it, how long you're doing it, and you have all the tools now to protect against aerosol and droplet transmission.
Excellent, Ryan. Thank you. And just to reinforce that, it's think about what you're doing, what's your activity, what the environment is you're doing it in, what your distance will be from other individuals, and how much time you'll be engaged in that activity in that environment with those people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay.
Yep. Get outdoors as much as possible. Wear your mask. Increase physical distance.
Wash your hands.
Everything public health officials have been harping on for quite a while. It's grounded in fundamental physics and chemistry. And now we can talk more about ventilation and all these different layer strategies. And I think we can be in good position moving forward now that we understand more about how this disease is spread. And I want to also put up a couple really good resources for people. This COVID estimator developed by Professor Jimenez at CU Boulder. It is good for looking at your relative risk, so going from a high risk to a lower risk. But I do caution that taking the absolute risk that is put out is not meant to say, okay, if you spend an hour with someone doing this activity, you are 100% going to get an infection. It's just meant to be about looking at relative risk. And then that portable air cleaner calculator I had mentioned, here's the website. I think that it's not conducive to copying down quite quickly though. And I want to...
We'll get these on the website, on the COVID-19 website too. We can put these as part of the resources that people could go back and find them. So that'd be helpful. Excellent.
And I want to also point out that a lot of what I talked about is work that has been developed over years from a lot of different researchers. Professor Jimenez, Lindsay Moore, there are a lot of different people doing a lot of good things right now. So that was not all just my work I talked about. It's a huge community of people doing a lot of really good research right now.
Well, thank you for synthesizing that and for the work you're doing at Trinity and with Trinity to help us do a better job protecting TU. We really, really appreciate that. And we learned a lot tonight, not only about kind of the 4 dimensions of risk and why that's risky behavior based on droplets versus aerosolization, but also we learned some tricks and tools we could use at home or in our rooms around filtration and maintaining relative humidity. So you packed a lot in. We really appreciate it. And it's so important to understand the why behind what we do. So thank you for helping us do that. Really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it. I am happy to field any questions. And there's so much more I wanted to say, but would drag on for many hours.
Well, it's a complex issue and a complex situation that we're all battling through together. And I think this is something we'll need to revisit again as we come back from winter break. It'll be a great time to have this webinar again, and perhaps we can pick up where we left off. So Ryan, if folks have a question post this webinar, is it all right if students, faculty, staff just email you with any questions, or would you like them to filter that through the Nerve Center? Any thoughts there? We can get you any follow-up questions.
Yeah, email is great.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely do that. And if you have questions and you miss Dr. Davis, just send it to us at the Nerve Center and we'll run it down for you with him. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to share your research and your knowledge and to make us all a little bit smarter, a little COVID smarter, and hopefully we'll go that much farther to protect TU. And thanks so much to Taylor Stakes with SCM for helping us put this webinar together, and Carla Sierra. They're committed to the sharing of really smart and good information to keep Trinity safe, and we appreciate their time as well. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. You have a great night, and if I don't see you, happy holidays.
You too.
All right, thanks.